We're here to talk about interview strategies. Thank you all for sharing who you are and what has brought you here today in the chat. A lot of questions, as Teresa already mentioned, on interview best practices, strategies, and we'll go through those. I saw a couple of unique questions around interviewing in a Canadian context for those who don't have either Canadian experience or a ton of work experience and what that might look like. And then some fairly specific questions, which we may or may not get to. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so if your question wasn't addressed in the session itself, you can just answer your question at that point, and we will turn off the recording when we get to the open Q&A. And after we do a Q&A, starting at about 2 o'clock, if we're able to stay on track, we will also have a bonus activity, which is an opportunity for you to practice with some of your peers, answering some questions and getting feedback from some of your peers on your answers to those questions. So I hope most of you can stick around for that, but if not, I'll highlight some other ways that you can get interview practice. So today what we'll do is interview basics. I'll go through some of the different formats, preparation, question types, and one method for constructing answers to questions. Then we'll go through some tips for remote interviews, which has always been a thing, but has become very, very prevalent in the last year and a half. Some strategies to address interview anxiety, and then some of the rights you have around navigating disclosure, and then I'll go through next steps and resources. So what is a job interview? Interviews are an opportunity to tell stories. Usually they're a minute or two long, although sometimes they can be longer, that demonstrate that you have the skills, experience, motivation, character traits, all of the different things that they're looking for in order to succeed in a particular role. Interviews, it's important to remember, interviews are also two-way. So you are assessing if this is the right role, the right team, the right organization for you, at the same time that they're evaluating whether you're the right person to fill this opportunity. So you'll want to ask questions at the end of the interview, and they're going to help you answer questions like, how well does this job match your skills and interests? Will it challenge you, and for how long? What is the working environment? Sometimes you have answers to those questions before the interview, but sometimes it's appropriate to bring up questions or variations of those questions in the interview itself when they turn it over to you and say, do you have anything to add or any questions for us? In terms of interview formats, there's a number of different formats. There are multiple round interviews. Any of you who are PhDs, postdocs looking at faculty positions, those I would consider multiple round interviews because of how intense they can be, spreading out over months, days, weeks, depending on the interview. There are screening by phone or pre-recorded videos, which are becoming increasingly common. There's back-to-back interviews, there's panel board and committee interviews, there's case or technical interviews. And if you've encountered any other interview formats, we'd love to hear about those in the chat. For remote interviews, there's sort of 3 styles that seem to be coming up. There's phone interviews, which have historically, and I think are still being used as a screening process. So usually human resources, someone in the human resources department would contact you, just verify some details from your application materials, and ask some very basic questions about your suitability for the role in order to determine if you're getting a full interview with the hiring committee. The most common is probably live video interviews. So these are done by Skype, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangout, any sort of video conferencing software. And it's you and the hiring committee or the hiring person if there's only one person. There's also an increasing frequency for pre-recorded video. So they are using software packages, usually AI, and it asks you a specific question. It gives you a period of time to think about your answer to that question, and then it records for a set period of time your answer to that question. So if your answer goes 2 minutes and 1 second, it'll cut off that 1 second because it's often 2 minutes that they give you. It might be less, but they will tell you that beforehand. And again, in the chat, would love to continue to hear what you're hoping to get out of this session today, but if there's any other interview formats you've seen, or if there's any pros or cons of remote interviews, would love to see some ideas in the chat. Okay. Other remote selection tools that you might encounter, there might be some work styles or soft skills assessments. There might be gamified assessments. There might be take-home assignments or cases. Usually these are like due at the same time as the interview or some period before or after the interview. And they might review your online presence. So go through your social media, LinkedIn, and Google accounts. In terms of interview preparation, there's a number of things that you can do to prepare for the interview. So first is research. You want to research the organization, their website, their social media, any sort of news, either through Google News or through more sophisticated databases like the library's Factiva database. You might look through industry. You might look at the industry quite broadly, but you might also use industry tools to learn more about a particular organization. If you can, and if the organization has done so, you could go through Glassdoor and see what interview format and what questions they typically have asked in the past. You'll definitely want to research your interviewers once they tell you who is going to be interviewing you, quickly going through LinkedIn and a Google search to find out who they are and what might make them tick in terms of answers to questions. And again, if you have that opportunity before you apply is the best time to do this, but if you don't have time before you apply, or if you have that opportunity to follow up after you apply and before you interview, it's great to connect with past or present employees of an organization to learn more about their experience in that organization and what they think you might be able to do to prepare. You'll want to prepare for questions in that interview. We have a number of resources and a guide. I will share the slides with Teresa so that they can be posted with the recording and shared with everyone who was here today, and even those who didn't make it today, so that you have access to the links, but they just go to careers.utoronto.ca and various parts of our website. You can look to the job description and your research to anticipate questions, and I'll show you an activity of how you might anticipate questions. And then you want to create responses to those anticipated questions. You can start practicing answers to questions that you think they might ask you. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you want to prepare some questions to ask them. And then the final thing that you want to do is practice telling your stories that will answer some of the questions that they're likely to ask you. In terms of anticipating questions or creating your own questions, and when we get to the optional activity just after 2, you'll have an opportunity to do this with jobs that are more interesting to you. But hypothetically, and I think this is pulled from one of our work study positions at the Career Center, some of the skills that we often require for our work study team are previous experience with one-on-one advising or consultation, previous experience with group advising and workshop facilitation, previous experience providing constructive feedback, and technical knowledge. And so on the right-hand side, so the left-hand side, you go through the job posting and you figure out what the core qualifications were. This is a valuable activity as you're creating your resume, and it's an equally valuable activity as you prepare for the interview. And then on the right-hand side, you anticipate versions of questions that you might ask if you were the hiring manager and you wanted to get more information about one-on-one advice in your consultations. So it might be something like, what are some important qualities or skills that a student advisor should have and why? How have you demonstrated these in the past? For group advising and workshop facilitation, tell me about your experience providing peer-to-peer support that made a difference in another student's personal or academic life. For questions around providing constructive feedback, tell me about a time you provided constructive feedback. What was the person's reaction? And technical knowledge. So do you have any experience screening, editing resumes? What are some common mistakes that you've encountered? Those are the types of questions that you might anticipate in an interview based on those qualifications. And again, it'll depend on the position you're applying for, what the questions are, but it's usually not much of a mystery. They go from the job posting and say, these are the things that are high priority for us. And these are the things that will help us distinguish between the 3 or 5 or 10 qualified candidates that they bring in for interviews. So another opportunity, I think, here to share in the chat, what is one question you've had success answering in the past, and what is one question that you've struggled with answering in the past? We'll wait for maybe 2 or 3 responses to this one before I move on to the next section of the presentation. These are great. And as is often the case, I think you've all gone to the second question, which is struggling with. Thank you to the individual that just put it in that you did well with strengths and weaknesses, because that's often a question that many of us struggle with. Good. So the first one, struggling with coding in an interview, depending on how it's set up, they sometimes ask you to code during the interview and they just give you a question. What we've heard from places like Google, when they do these types of questions, you're not supposed to just use the whiteboard and try to answer the question, or the virtual whiteboard if you're doing it virtually. You are supposed to ask questions of the person who is in the room with you doing that interview, because sometimes there's information that they've withheld when they're doing these technical interviews, or sometimes they just want to hear your thought process. So if you just like work out an answer and turn around and say, ta-da, here's my answer, they might say, okay, walk me through your answer, but generally it's better to talk them through your process as you're working through it, so that they can understand your thought process, but they can also ask you clarifying questions, and you can ask them clarifying questions. Yeah, these are all really common experiences. The strengths and weaknesses question is often challenging, and the previous employer question is also often challenging for folks. And I don't fully understand why some organizations ask that question, because it really should be about how can you do this role, not why aren't you doing your previous role anymore. But not all interviewers ask good questions, and that makes it particularly challenging to prepare. Okay, so the questions that you're sharing that you've struggled with fit into a few different categories for interview questions. And so there's 4 common interview questions, and then there's a 5th question, which I hope you never see, but you might see. So the 4 common types of questions are open-ended questions. They're usually, say, the very first question in the interview, and it's something like, tell me about yourself, or tell me why you're interested in this position, or tell me why you think you would be a good fit for this position, or tell me about how your experience prepares you for this position. Number of different formats for that question, but it's usually the first question in an interview, or the first couple questions in an interview. There isn't necessarily a right answer. It's an opportunity for you to start talking, get some of the nerves out, and for them to understand broadly who you are and what makes you a good fit for the position. The most common type of interview and the most common type of question in interviews these days are behavioral questions. These often take the form of, tell me about a time when you exhibited X, where X is a skill or competency from the job posting. And so these are the easiest to anticipate because you just go back to the job posting. Ideally, you copy and paste every job posting in your process of putting together your resume and cover letter for that application, and you save all of those separately so that you can find them again. But you go through that job posting and it says project management, and so you come up with a question about project management where the simplest form is tell me about a time when you managed a project, but there are other forms of that question. Similar to behavioral questions, but slightly different in how they're constructed, are situational or scenario questions. And these often take the form of, what would you do if, or in this role, you might see this and this happen, how would you respond to it? And the reason I say they're similar to behavioral questions is because a good answer to these questions would take a form of, here's how I would deal with the hypothetical that you're giving me. And I would do that because I've done this thing, which was exactly the same as the hypothetical that you have presented me with, or because I've done this thing that's fairly close to the hypothetical that you're presenting me with. Technical questions are usually like field specific or technical to the job. And so they might be what you know about infection control. They might be how do you set up a pivot table. It might be even more specific, and the example I was providing earlier with coding, like they might give you a problem and say you need to code an answer for this. You have 15 minutes or you have an hour or something like that. So there are interviews that are entirely technical questions or case questions, which are very common in management consulting. But it's possible you get simplified versions of technical questions in a more standard style of interview. And so when it comes to, the fifth type, before I move on to answering these questions, the fifth type, which, as I said, I hope you never see because they don't work the way interviewers think they work, are unpredictable questions. And so these are things like, who would win in a fight between Optimus Prime and Iron Man, which is a real example that a student shared in a previous version of this workshop. Or what color would you be if you could be any color? What's your favorite fruit and why? Or if you could be a fruit, what fruit would you pick and why? They're unpredictable because they're weird. And they don't do what an employer thinks they're doing. So they're hoping to catch you off guard so that they can hear your problem-solving strategy. Do you believe life is fair? That's another good, unpredictable question. They're trying to catch you up with something that you can't have anticipated, so you can't have memorized an answer for, you can't have created an answer for. What they're looking for is what's your problem-solving strategy. So if you talk them through your problem-solving strategy, then you're answering the question in a way that's effective for them. But they really don't work. There's all kinds of research in why these don't work and why employers should stop asking them, but some employers do. And you can't say this question doesn't work the way you think it's going to work, and you should stop asking it because that's probably not going to get you the job, which means you have to play along with their game as they're asking that question. So answering, in particular, behavioral questions requires a little bit of structure to your stories. So behavioral questions and, as I said, situational questions are also story-based, and open-ended can be story-based as well. And your stories need structure. And this is a strategy for giving your story's structure. It's not the only strategy. So we often talk about the STAR technique. The CAR technique is nearly the same thing. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, results. CAR is context, action, results. And so this is a way of constructing stories so that you're answering the question. So they say, tell me about a time when you managed a project. You're like, well, when I was doing my engineering degree at the University of Toronto, I was working on this research project. I did this, this, and this in terms of managing the project throughout, and my results were this and this, which demonstrate the effectiveness of my project management experience. So you'd fill in more of the details, but that's roughly what it might look like if you were using that STAR technique. What works all of the time, so STAR is one way. What I find works all the time is a reminder to be specific and be relevant in your response to the question. And so that one I find helpful all the time. And sometimes with STAR, it's helpful to not just include results, but to include relevance. So linking it back to the question that they've asked, or linking it back to the position. At the end of the interview, they're always going to say, do you have anything to add, or do you have any questions for us? And so good questions that you can ask them allow you to learn things that will help you determine if the organization or position is the right fit for you. It's also an opportunity to add or clarify an earlier response. And it's your final 30-second pitch for why you think they should hire you. If you don't feel like you nail it in the interview in terms of that 30-second pitch or that opportunity to clarify, like if there's something that occurs to you after the interview, you want to send them a thank you. And the thank you, we often recommend 24 hours. So the one question that you can ask towards the end of the interview is, what are your next steps in the process? And if they say, we're finishing our interviews today and we will make a decision tomorrow, then you know that you need to send your thank you email today. And if they say, oh, it's going to take us another week or so to get through interviews, then you can take the day to think about what happened in the interview and see if there's anything that you want to add to clarify any of your responses, to correct anything, any of those details. Good question in the chat, and then we'll answer that right now as I'm going. If you don't have contact information for all of the interviewers, you can just send a thank you to the person that coordinated the interview and say, could you pass this along to everyone who was there in the interview? And you can thank them for their efforts in coordinating the interview, and then put a like, could you forward this to the interviewers so that they can receive my thank you for the interview itself. You do need to be patient after you send that thank you email. They will do what they need to do. And then as soon as you apply to a job, you need to think through who your references are going to be for that job if you do happen to get an interview. And before the interview, it's usually a good idea to contact the people that you think are references and say, I'm going in for an interview for this position. Are you available in the next few days or in the next week or so to be a reference for this particular position? If so, what do you need to prepare to provide that reference? And if you're using the same people frequently, then you'll know what they need, and you can just say, hey, got this other interview. Hopefully this doesn't conflict with any vacation that you have scheduled, and here's the material that you routinely ask for. So always good to check in with your references. And then usually after the interview, they'll say, we're going to contact your references now, is that okay? And then you reach out to your references again and say, you can expect to hear from this person in the next day or so, because they're moving on to references. Okay. And then the other thing that might come up before you even apply, or as part of your application, it might come up in the interview, it might come up after the interview. The best time for it to come up is once you're negotiating a job offer, but you do want to know what salary expectations could or should be. So ideally, these are in the job posting and you just have to respond to the job posting, but sometimes they aren't. And so Glassdoor, I mentioned it earlier, as a good resource for questions and reviews of organizations. It also is a good resource for researching salary. for people who have worked at that organization with similar job titles. And then another tool is Job Bank, which is really good because it can allow you to narrow down, like, across an entire sector, across a job title, what's the typical salary, what is it in different locations across the country, so Canada specifically, and different ways of researching salary information so that you're prepared when they say, how much are you expecting to earn in this position? You can say, well, based on my research and looking at Glassdoor and looking at the job bank, I was able to determine that people living in Toronto doing this type of work make between 60 and 65,000. I believe that my master's of engineering from the University of Toronto, plus the 2 years of experience I have in industry, would put me at the like $63,000 to $65,000 chunk of that range. Hopefully it's higher, but I'm just throwing out some numbers as an example of what you might do. So you would research what the entire range is, tell them what that range is, and then tell them briefly why you think you should fit in a specific subset of that range of potential salaries. Tips and techniques. So you want to be as natural as possible. With virtual, you want to log in basically right on time with the expectation that they're probably running interview to interview or meeting to meeting, and so they might be a minute or two late. You want to dress professionally. So someone asked earlier if you have to wear a tie, and I mean, that's industry specific. Our advice for dressing professionally is wear what you think you would wear on like your most professional day on the job, or a little bit better than what you would wear on a typical day in that job. So if it's, you know, a job in student life at the University of Toronto, you're probably going to be wearing like jeans and a polo shirt, or jeans and a t-shirt regularly. And so you would want to wear like nice pair of dress pants, a nice, if you're male, or if you're dressing as male identifying, you might want to have like a button-up shirt and a tie. You might go even further and go to a full suit, but that would be like significantly better than you would dress in a day-to-day in my job, for instance, although there are other jobs where you might be expected to wear a suit every single day. And there isn't really anything better in terms of professional attire than a suit. So that would be the expected attire in the interview. To the salary question, I see that in the chat right there. Yes, ideally, you're not the one presenting the salary expectations first, but some employers are really insistent, and there's just no way for you to get them to say first. So if you have to go first, then you present your research back. You want to be mindful of your body language as best as possible. So it's good to practice recording yourself when you're doing remote interviews so that you see what it looks like to look at the camera, see what it looks like to look at the people on your screen, see what it looks like to be looking at any notes that you've prepared for yourself, so that you can get comfortable doing that. You want to, again, this is where recording can be very helpful, or getting feedback from friends and colleagues to get a sense of how people are perceiving your tone of voice, your body language, and the actual content and delivery of your answers. Some additional tips for remote interviewing: you want to make sure that you're really comfortable with your equipment, so you're not jumping onto it for the very first time. Same thing goes for software. Like, if possible, test the software beforehand. You want to make sure that your internet connection is as reliable as possible. Everyone knows that there might be problems with that, so have your backup plan. Be ready to call in, or to get call-in information from them if they haven't provided that for you. And then you want to be cognizant of your location, cleaning it up as best as possible. Pay attention to your lighting as best as possible. And I have cats, and they are very disruptive, so I have the door closed to this room so that they aren't running in and creating any of those distractions or interruptions. We've all been doing this for 18 months or so. So we're all used to these interruptions and distractions, and we're not that put off by them, but you know, if you can avoid as many of them as possible, that is ideal. Good question. I see that in the chat around stress, and that leads me into the next slide. So a lot of people feel anxious, stressed, uncomfortable in interviews. Some people feel more comfortable in person, some people may feel more comfortable remote, but almost everyone feels some level of anxiety or stress in interviews. And a little bit of stress is a good thing. Too much stress is a bad thing. And so there's some research out of the University of Guelph at their Personnel Selection and Performance Lab about a couple of strategies that they found in their sort of extensive research project on this that work better than others. And the two that they find work better than others are positive self-talk and field technique or field perspective taking. Positive self-talk is telling yourself positive stories about your previous experience as you wait for the interview to start, but you can also do it in advance because you would put a star construction to these, so situation, task, action, results, reflection, to these stories. So you're basically practicing interview answers, but you're focusing on positive things, problems you're really proud of solving, problematic interactions you've had with other people that resolved really well, and you're confident with the steps you took to resolve those conflicts. Any other like career related thing where you feel good about what you did in that experience, because those make good interview answers. Field perspective technique is imagining the interview from the interviewer's perspective. And there's two times that this is helpful in preparing for interviews. One is in advance of the interview, when you look at the job posting and say to yourself, if I was the hiring manager, what questions would I ask to figure out who's a good fit for the role? The other time it's helpful is when they ask you a question in the interview and you're like, oh, this is a really weird question, or I hadn't thought of this question. Instead of saying to yourself, what do I want to say? You could think of it as, what do they want to hear from me in this moment? And that can be helpful in, you know, biding your time a little bit to think of your answer, but also for constructing your answer in a way that's going to connect with what they're looking for. So those are a couple of research-based strategies for dealing with interview anxieties. And they work really well with all of the material that I've gone through so far in this session, because they reinforce the value of thinking through your stories, so coming up with stories, because stories are the things that we need to do to answer interview questions, but constructing your stories in a specific way where you think about what the results were, because the results are the things that make us feel confident. And sharing those results will help an interviewer understand the impact that you had. And then field perspective, as I said, we just talked about anticipating questions. So it's the strategy for anticipating questions, but it's also a strategy for constructing answers that are going to work well for the people listening to your responses. Because interviews are a stressful situation, and many of you have been through a number of stressful situations in your life to date, whether they're oral exams, if you've had any of those, or whether they're just written exams. And so you also want to think through strategies that you've used to calm yourself in other stressful situations. And so for many students, this often includes a variety of visualization, breathing activities, exercise and movement, listening to your favorite music, affirmations, planning enjoyable post-interview activities, getting a good amount of sleep before the interview, making sure that you're hydrated and nourished, whatever those activities are that you've used to help manage your stress in the past. are worth trying again, but the positive self-talk and the field technique are both valuable additions if you have not used those before. A few minutes, I'll get started on questions in a couple minutes, but just a couple more things to share in terms of wrap up. So as I said, practice, practice, practice. And for those of you that stick around after 2, you'll have an opportunity to practice. But you can practice interviewing with peers, with friends. You can practice with yourself, and you can record your answers. One tool that you could use to record your answers is Big Interview, which you can find on the Career and Co-Curricular Learning Network, clnx.utoronto.ca. Under the resources section, Big Interview has standard interview questions. It has like delightful human resource recordings that will ask you those questions, and then you can record your answer to those questions and share it and get feedback. There's a similar tool on LinkedIn where you can record your answers and get feedback. You can book an appointment with myself or any of the other career educators, and we are happy to do a mock interview with you. You just have to bring a copy of the job posting primarily, although it's also sometimes helpful to have a copy of your resume and cover letter that you submitted for that job posting. But we are happy to work through coming up with questions with you and reviewing your answers to those questions. The last thing before we get to questions is just around discrimination in job interviews and what some of your rights are. So there's a link here to some tools around understanding your rights in interviews. We have a workshop that we do usually about twice a term with Downtown Legal Services, where they go through and talk about some of the legal interpretations of what can and cannot happen in interviews, and they share a number of other resources. It's important to note that what can and cannot happen in an interview depends on the province that you're in. There's no national, well, there are some national expectations, but usually it's provincial that the laws around discrimination and rights in interviews are located. And it would be the same in the US for anyone who's looking at that it's state specific, although there's a lot of consistency across states and across provinces. If you've encountered discriminatory questions in the past, then you'll want to think through how you might respond to those types of questions if they come up again in the future. And again, it's up to you what that strategy is, but if they're willing to ask discriminatory questions in the interview, it's probably a poor indication on that employer, and something to bear in mind in this being a two-way choice or a two-way process. Deciding if and when to disclose. So if you require accommodation in the interview process, or if you require accommodation to do the role really well, you have rights and you have responsibilities around disclosure. It is your personal choice. There's no single best way to do this. They cannot ask you a question about a disability. If your disability is not going to affect your ability to do the job, you do not need to disclose it. If you, however, your disability is going to impact your ability to do the interview or the job, then let them know what the accommodation is. There's a lot of, most people are hesitant about this. When we talk to employers, they have all kinds of stories about people disclosing disability in their exit interviews after they've been fired because they weren't able to do the job. And the employer's like, if you told me this 4 months ago when we hired you, we could have done something about it. But now we can't do anything about it. So employers would prefer that people say something earlier, but I can understand those of you who have reservations about disclosing to an employer early in the process, because it's very difficult to prove that they're using that disclosure to then decide not to hire you. And so anyone who's encountered that sort of discrimination in the past is like, well, they're just going to use that to discriminate. And it's a very tricky situation. So again, a career educator is happy to talk you through a specific instance of this, and we might recommend that you talk to Downtown Legal Services or other legal advice if it's a serious situation. I mentioned that there's the different ways of interview practice, and then we have tools on our website that you can access that go through sample questions and ways to do that.